Everyone, and let's get straight to it. I'm going to share the screen, and so if there it is. I'm just letting you know there's the Makorot that went out yesterday. So last night, this is, I guess, I have does everyone see the screen? Hello?
כן, אני חושב שכן עשיתי אותך, כן? אתה כן יכול.
אוקיי, בסדר, לא, רואים את זה?
שנייה, עכשיו כן, עכשיו כן.
אוקיי, בסדר, אז, so this is not exactly the Makorot that were sent out yesterday or Tuesday. I'm not sure when they were sent out. Last night I was I'm always tweaking things, and I added a few things to the Daf Makorot. Anybody who's interested in the final version, I'll say the current version, because who knows, maybe next time I'll give this year, I'll change things some more. And there's a few surprises along the way, which we'll hopefully see. But in the meantime, just to take a look at the Daf Makorot, what I wanted, it's a little bit more perhaps relevant to last week's parsha, though of course the relationship of Sara to Ishmael and to Hagar continues to be of issue in this week's parsha as well. But really, this topic I think is relevant not only for Parshat Lech Lecha, maybe Parshat Vayera. It's also relevant for later on in Sefer Bereshit, with regard in Parshat Vayetze, with regard to Rachel, Bilha, Leah, and Zilpah, and their children. What's the relationship between the children of the Shvachot and the primary, we'll call it whether it be it Rachel, be it Leah. But as it worked out, in terms of the shiurim that I'm giving in this framework, so I wasn't giving the shiur for Lech Lecha, and I wasn't giving the shiur for Vayetze, so I figured I would. I think I'm on for Toldot, but I could have done this in either this week or in 2 weeks in Toldot. So I picked this week. But so let's take a look at the parsha and talk about the question of surrogacy in halacha, because really, if you think about it, it's I remember as much as I can remember of third grade. That I remember that when we learned this, and this is when we learned the Parshat Lech Lecha, and I thought it very strange at the time, and I guess maybe I still think of it a little strange. What was Sara trying to accomplish in the first place? Sara Eshet Avram. Let's take a look at the first source. Sara Eshet Avram lo yalda lo Bilha shivcha mitzrit ushma Hagar. So Sarai at that point has no children. They have been in Eretz Yisrael for 10 years at that point. The Torah will make that explicit in 2 psukim time. This is one of the sources for the idea of that the expectation that people can wait for 10 years for a child, and then if not, so then perhaps more drastic steps need to be taken. Be that as it may, they have come into Eretz Canaan. They had this promise. Lot, who was the heir apparent, is no longer in the picture, because he's moved to Sdom, and here Sarai is looking at the situation and feels something needs to be done. Vatomer Sarai el Abraham hinei natzarani Hashem miledet. God has prevented me from having a child. Bo na el shivchati. So come take my servant. Ulai ibanem mimena. Perhaps I will build from her. Right? It's not that you will build from her. It's ibaneh. I will build. Vayishma Avram lekol Sarai. Vatikach Sarai eshet Avram. את הגר המצרית שפחתה מקץ 10 שנים לשבת אברהם בארץ כנען, ותיתן אותה לאברהם אישה לא לאישה. So she gave her to Abraham, her husband, and the Torah is stressing that Abraham remains Sarai's husband, Isha, and gives her but Isha as a wife. In other words, there is this sense that Hagar is not just simply being Sarai's shifcha, that but now she has been, her own status has been elevated as well. I'll mention that that there apparently was a Hittite custom, which they found records of, that the children of servants, when they were born to the master, but the servant being the property of the primary wife, would be considered the offspring of the wife. So perhaps this is a framework within that overall cultural framework, which is so foreign to us, which is on every level. I mean, just having servants is foreign to us. But the idea that that there is this sense that the offspring of one woman could be considered the offspring of another, so is culturally not as foreign at the time as it may seem to us now. Could also point to other examples in the Torah. If you think about Yibum, for example, the very idea that the child of one brother will be considered to be the offspring of the deceased brother, and we see this in terms of whether it's the brother, whether it's the way that people view in terms of the story of Yehuda and Tamar, the story of Ruth and Boaz. So this is a notion which is not totally foreign to the thinking of the Torah. In any event, Rashi, when he talks about this, talks about it from a different perspective. Ibaneh mimena bischut she'achnis tzarati letoch beiti. So Rashi, by saying here in number 2 that it's bischut, that this be considered that that what Sara is saying is not that the child Yishmael, who is known as Yishmael, will be her offspring, but rather that by her selfless act that she is doing here, in other words, she's taking a rival, and we see in the ensuing prakim how deep and bitter a rivalry it can become, that by bringing this rival into her home and elevating a shivcha into the status of a second wife, that God will give her, this will be a schut, that she will be rewarded with a child. This is not exactly the way that the Ramban sees it. The Ramban, on the other hand, when he speaks about Vayishma Avram L'Kol Sarai, so he says that the Torah never said Vayas Ken. It's interesting. Very frequently when there is a demand, a request of one party, so the Torah will say Vayas Ken, and so Avraham in this case did. But that doesn't appear here. Rather, it says Aval Amar Ki Shama L'Kol Sarai, that Vayishma Avram L'Kol Sarai, that he listened to her. Yirmoz Ki Afal Pi She'Avram Mitaveh Ma'od Lebanim, Lo Asa Ken B'Lo Reshut Sarai. Avram was also aware of the different means of having offspring other than with the wife of his, we'll say, with his, at this point, his only wife, but certainly there would be nothing in that society, no one would think twice if Abraham would take a second wife in order to, especially considering that his first wife was barren. But nevertheless, he never would dream of doing such a thing without Sarai's permission. The Gam Ata, and similarly, even now, his love for Sarai was such, לא נתכוון שיבנהו מהגר ויהיה זרעו ממנה, אבל כל כוונתו לעשות רצון שרה שתיבנה ממנה. So his entire, it's not vayas ken in the sense of now there's going to be a child of Hagar, but rather it's going to be a child of Sarah. Sheyela nachat ruach b'nei shivchata. Either that she will have a some kind of consolation from the fact that at least her servant has the son, and it'll be a foster son of some kind for Sarah. Oh, as Rashi had said, so this is going to become a good omen for Sarah to be able to have a child of her own, which is of course ultimately what does occur, not necessarily b'schut of this action, but of course Sarah has her own son. Here I just want to, because there is a great deal to talk about on the, if you will, the contemporary halachic scene. So I want to streamline the Parsha introduction. I just want to take a very quick glance at the difference between how the Torah describes this relationship between Sarah, Avram, and Hagar, as opposed to the relationship of Rachel, Yaakov, and Bilha. Here the Torah says, Ulai ibanem mimena. So perhaps I will be able to build through the aegis of Hagar. Rachel, however, the Netziv in his commentary points out the difference. Rachel Amra vateled al birkai, that she will give birth literally on my knees, on my legs. But Rachel, in effect, will perhaps acting as the midwife for the children of Bilha, for Dan, for Naphtali. V'ibane gam anochi mimena. See the difference? That it's v'ibane gam anochi, not ulai ibane, but v'ibane gam anochi, that I will build. Hakavana b'zeh. So the Netziv says that the intent, this subtle difference, is such shehi tegadel tavlad v'teh ki'ilu yaldan. And this is also implicit in the vatelad al birkai. Rachel is saying from the get-go that her intent is to be the foster, the adopted mother of the children of Bilha. And as a result, it'll be as though she is indeed the mother. Ma she'en ken Sarah lo chavtza legadel ben shivchata. Sarah never intended on having a real relationship with Yishmael. It was as much more pro forma. It also explains, perhaps on a psychological level, with obviously the relationship between Hagar and Sarah is very different. There's no indication at all that Bilha ever lorded over Rachel in any way, the fact that she was having children while Rachel was still childless. But and of course Hagar does exactly that. But nevertheless, there is clearly Yishmael, Sarah is from almost moment one, is looking at him in an adversarial type of way. And not as a child of her own. So as long as, sorry, someone have a question? As long as as long as Sarah was, as long as Ishmael was the only child, she was willing to tolerate him. Once Yitzchak is born, so then there is and there is whatever that relationship that's described in our parsha this week, where that Sarah sees Yishmael mitzachek, right, is playing with with Yitzchak in an inappropriate way, from her perspective or perhaps objectively, it doesn't matter at the moment. But the point, though, is that she never, viewed him as her child, whereas Rachel was looking for an adoptive child, and was using, in effect, Bilha as her surrogate. Al ken amra ulai ibaneh shieli eze zchut b'zikaron tov be'oto zera. In other words, for Sarah, it's only a prayer that this is going to, in some way, allow her to move forward. Whereas for Rachel, so the Bilha is much more of a surrogate, and the children are really her children, Rachel's children, and this becomes perhaps also the reason why ultimately all of the children of the Shvachot are considered to be part of Am Yisrael, whereas the children of Avraham, whether the children of Hagar, namely Yishmael, or the children of Keturah, who will be born, the 6 children that Avraham will father with Keturah in next week's Parsha, in Parshat Chayei Sarah. So they are not considered to be truly they have a certain status as the offspring of Avraham, but they are not considered to be part of what we will later call Am Yisrael. So with that in mind, so we see that this idea of what is known in Hebrew as pundakaut, surrogacy, is something which harks back emotionally, perhaps even before Sarah, but certainly in terms of even on a practical level, using whatever technology that people have, so that the avot have very limited options when it comes to their technology. But over the course of the last 40 years or so, and especially in the last 25, 30 years, so the ability to have children starting with IVF and then using surrogates, and now that technology is continuing to develop, and maybe we'll touch at the end of the shiur about the possibility of there being actually 3 women involved, not just the if you will, the egg donor, might be called the biological mother, or not only the birth mother, the surrogate, but also now that there is the technique of mitochondrial DNA replacement, so you can have a situation where an ovum is the product of one woman, and if there is some defect in the mitochondria in effect being the battery that powers all cells, but is minuscule in terms of the actual cell tissue, but the mitochondria is spliced in from a donor. So in effect, the ovum, the biological component, is the product of 2 women, and then if you have the birth mother, so theoretically you have 3. Not only theoretically, here in Israel, it's been legal for several years to be, and so there are people who are walking amongst us who are the product of that, and the questions now become great. How should we view this situation? Should we view just in terms of asking who is the mother? At this point, this is a shiur that you can go online and you'll see this seems to be an incredibly popular topic in terms of people seem to be fascinated by this issue. Invariably, the shiur is entitled who's your mother, or who's my mother, harking back to the P.D. Eastman children's book, Are You My Mother? And the question becomes, so okay, there are many halachic questions that that need to be dealt with if in terms of deciding who is the halachic mother. And here there are many different options. It could be of course, the genetic mother. We'll leave the mitochondria question aside for the moment. Could be the woman who donated the ovum, donated the egg, and then the question, if that's the case, or let's go through the different possibilities. It could be perhaps the birth mother, who's will be considered the mother halachically. It could be perhaps we're going to see that both the genetic mother and the birth mother are going to be considered to be the mother in this circumstance. This is and perhaps one might argue, and there were those who argued that perhaps halachically, legally speaking, there is no mother. In other words, perhaps you can make an argument that in order for there to be a maternal connection halachically. Now, I want to stress we're dealing with on the legal level, not on the sociological level, because even in a circumstance where, let's say, there is an adoptive parent, so an adoptive parent halachically doesn't have a status of a parent in the sense of automatic. Just to give you a couple of examples, in terms of Yerusha, for example, in terms of in terms of inheritance, the child in an adopted relationship is considered to be a person who is not an automatic heir of his or her adopted parents. A similar situation would arise with regard to the halachot of arayot, of considering the question of from a perspective of relationships, and can an adoptive son marry his sister of his adopted sister? So legally, at least in terms of there might be other issues that are involved, but in terms of it would not be considered to be arayot. However, in this circumstance, would it be considered to be arayot if you have let's say you have a surrogate who's carrying the child, and she is a Jewess, are her own biological children the halachic children, the halachic siblings of the child that she carried for another person? So that's a very important question that needs to be decided. Perhaps most basic is the status of the child with regard to their Judaism. If one or the other, because this can happen in both directions. If you're dealing with a child, if the child is if the child is Jewish, I shouldn't say that. If the birth mother is, let's say, Jewish, and you have a situation not of a surrogate, but here of an egg donor, for whatever the reason, the mother was unable to produce a viable ovum, but she is herself able to bring the child to term. So there's a donor egg, and let's say the sperm of her husband, and that's implanted in her uterus, and she brings the child to term. So halachically, is that child, if the donor ovum was, if the woman who donated that egg was not Jewish, is the child going to be considered to be Jewish at birth? And of course, the inverse is going to apply if the mother's own egg, meaning the biological mother, is unable to bring the child to term, so therefore they need to go to a surrogate to carry the baby. Is that child going to be considered to be Jewish if the surrogate, they went, let's say, to Romania, to India, and this is where the child is born to a non-Jewish woman, but the egg was actually the egg of the woman who will raise the child. So is that child Jewish, or does the child need to be undergo conversion? So as I said, you can look at it as either or you can look at it that perhaps they are both going to be considered in some way the mother, or perhaps you need to have the entire package, meaning that the way that halacha is going to view maternity is a person who is both the woman who is both the genetic mother as well as the birth mother. They are both necessary components. Neither is sufficient, and a person born to under these circumstances may legally, halachically, have no mother at all. Okay, so this is the question. I see that in the chat. So people have asked me to give a translation for arayot. Arayot meaning incestuous relationships. And in terms of the question that was raised here as to a Kohen, so Kohen is a slightly different question. Kohen is someone who follows because it's following the father's lineage. So as long as the mother is going to be considered to be Jewish, so then the offspring will be considered to be a Kohen if the father was a Kohen. If, on the other hand, it's going to be decided that that because of, let's say, in a circumstance that the birth mother is going to be the woman who is the determinant with regard to the identity of the child that's born to her, even if the genetic material that led to that pregnancy was donated by a Jewish woman, so then the child will not be considered to be Jewish and will have to undergo a conversion process, gerut. And so, of course, under those circumstances, the child will not be considered to be a Kohen any more than if a Kohen were to have a relationship with a non-Jewish woman. The issue of that relationship would not be considered to be a Kohen. The issue would not be considered to be Jewish at all, and would have to undergo conversion. So this is that, if you will, is the background in terms of understanding. And so how do we go about looking at it? So if I were to ask most people here, my guess is that instinctively we would think that the genetic mother is going to be considered to be the mother. And if that's the case, by the way, just harking back to what I referred to earlier, if you deal with a situation where there are two genetic mothers, meaning that one woman is giving the overwhelming majority of the DNA, and the other woman is the donor for the mitochondria. So then the question becomes open again. Even if I'm focusing on the genetic side, can there be a partnership, or does the one obviate the other? So, as I said, maybe we'll get to that question at the end of this year, depending on how much time is left. But right now, we'll assume that there is only one genetic mother. But I think that most of us would instinctively argue that, of course, it's the genetics which is going to be the determining factor. This, however, is not necessarily the case, and and here maybe a spoiler alert here. I find this particular case fascinating halachically speaking, because it is a situation where you have it's, as I said, as we all know, that surrogacy has been around now for several decades, and it has been debated by the Gdolei HaPoskim going back to unfortunately now of the previous generation, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Elyashiv, Rabbi Vadia, etc. And there is no real consensus. In other words, the question remains to a certain extent an open question in terms of determining we'll say the clearest question, namely, is the child considered to be Jewish if one or the other, meaning either the birth mother or the genetic mother, are not Jewish? And that remains a question and an issue of debate, to the extent that I don't know how many of you, for example, have watched Shtisel. So in the last season of Shtisel, one of the characters, Ruchami, undergoes or doesn't undergo, doesn't really matter, of the question of a procedure where she needs a surrogate, and within certain Haredi circles, the standard psak halacha is that there shouldn't be a surrogate question at all. In other words, people should not use surrogates to bring children into the world because of the various halachic, sociological, psychological, emotional issues that are involved, that it is very strongly recommended against in certain certain circles. Also, in terms of even to the extent of the basic psak halacha in many Haredi circles, is that just to say no, and not to deal with the problem at all. So now let's take a look, having said all of that as a bit of a introduction, to take a look at some of the makorot. We'll assume for the moment that, as I said, instinctively we might say, of course, it's the genetic material that is going to be the determining factor. Why should it not be? So here, there are several makorot that need to be addressed in this. Some of them are going to be agadic, some of them are going to be more halachic. Because this is, of course, whenever you deal with a new technology, a new circumstance that just never existed before, so the halachasis is going to look at different situations that were dealt by Chazal, to see if there's some kind of precedent that can be derived and used in order to give us an understanding of what the halacha should be today with the current technology. So the case that I feel is and I think most authors, there's at the end of this sheet, the updated sheet, not the one that was sent out. I'll ask maybe to anyone who's interested, I'll be happy to forward you the new sheet that I've added, just to go down towards the end of the sheet, the several readings for people who are interested in this question. 4 different articles starting back in the 1990s, going into the last 3-4 years, that really give a much fuller explanation of the issues that are involved than what I'm able to get across in an hour's time. So the Gemara here, the source number 5, the Gemara talks about the following case: Shnei achim te'umim geirim, v'chein mishucharim. So you have 2 twin brothers who are converts. they are they were born non-Jewish, and they both decide to convert to Judaism. And they could be identical twins. So their genetic material is as close to being identical as is possible. The B'chein Mishuchrarim, similarly, if you have two twins who were slaves, and they were non-Jewish slaves, and they were both freed, and when they become free men, so then they automatically are given the status of being full Jews, being an Eved Kanani, being a non-Jewish slave owned by a Jew, is a second-class Judaism. The person is considered to be Jewish halachically, but not quite fully. And then immediately upon release, there's no need for any further gerut. And this is also something that can begin to be learned from what happens in the end of last week's parsha, Parshat Lech Lecha, where Abraham is instructed to give the Brit Milah to all of the servants in his home as well. So getting back to our case of the two brothers, so lo chotzin v'lo miyavnim ve'ein chayavin mishum eshet ach. So the Breita says quite explicitly that they are not considered to be brothers legally, to the extent, as I said, they are two brothers. They would not engage in yibum, meaning that if one of them, after they've converted, would pass away without children, the other would not be allowed, or not have any. There would be no gain to have him enter into a levirate relationship with his sister-in-law, to marry his sister-in-law and to bring children into the world in his brother's name. That wouldn't fly. Oh, chotzin, nor is there any need for that woman to receive a chalitza, to receive a break from that relationship, and to undergo that procedure in order to allow her to marry another party. And most perhaps important here, ein chayavin mishum eshet ach. But there is no, if one brother, the halacha is that it is forbidden for a man to have any sexual relations, or to marry a woman who had been the wife of his brother, his sister-in-law. So regardless whether or not the brother and this woman have divorced one from the other, whether the brother has passed away and she is his widow, it is asur, it's forbidden for him to marry his sister-in-law. The only exception would be the yibum case that we just spoke about before, that if the first brother had passed away without a child, and then in effect this is a continuation of that first marriage on whatever level that is. So here you have a situation where you have two brothers. They are married to, one is married, he, let's say, passes away. His brother is, his biological brother is not forbidden to marry his sister-in-law, because at the time of conversion, the two people it's considered to be Leida Mechadash. It's considered to be a new birth. We don't like saying in terms of Judaism being born again, but in effect, that's what has occurred. We view them as a totally fresh start. Whatever relationships existed before their conversion is not considered to be, or no longer considered to be relationships. On a sociological level, again, caveat added, and this is a very important, fascinating topic in its own right, in terms of the relationship. What relationship does a convert have with his birth family, with his biological family, in terms of of kibud av ve'em, honoring those people, his parents, in terms of mourning when they pass away, etc. So those are very important halachic questions. But in terms of on a legal standing, the legal standing here being focused on two areas, namely the question of incestuous relationships, arayot, and the question of legal relationships in terms of inheritance. So there is a total break, a rebirth for the convert. As a result, these two people, these two twins, both of them were reborn, and they have no relationship not only with their biological family that did not convert, but also with the biological family that did convert. So this is so that's the halacha in that case. Okay, now we have the following twist on the case. Haita horatan shelo b'kedusha v'leidatan b'kedusha. If you had a situation where their mother had become pregnant while she was still not Jewish, and then she converted. So she converted while they were still in utero, and they were born to a Jewish woman, but they were conceived by the same woman who was not Jewish at the time of conception. So are these brothers going to be considered to be converts, or are they going to be considered to be full Jews? So here the halacha is lo chotzin v'lo miyabnin, aval chayavin mishum eshet ach. So in terms of, and we'll leave aside the question of why they don't do the yibum right now. That's not really our issue. What I want to focus on is this: chayavin mishum eshet ach. That here they are considered to be brothers, and therefore, if one of those brothers were to pass away, or one of the brothers were to divorce his wife, so his brother cannot marry the sister-in-law, meaning that they are considered to be, when they were born as brothers. They're born Jewish. Then finally, if you have Haita horatan v'leidatan b'kedusha, harehen ki Yisrael l'chol divreihem. Had, of course, this isn't this really isn't a question as to why this is the case, but if they were conceived after their mother had converted, and they were born after she had been converted, well, that usually is going to be the way it works. So then they are full Jews, and there isn't any restriction with regard to yibum either. So here, what you can see from this, and there are those who want to derive this, is that here we have a situation, in effect, where a woman is her own surrogate. Well, she conceived the child when she was not Jewish. Now she becomes Jewish in the process of during the time of the pregnancy. So as she's carrying that child, the child becomes Jewish because the child is born to a Jewish mother. So conversely, had the child been born to a non-Jewish mother, if you could create a situation which until modern technology was impossible, but if you were to create a situation where the child had been conceived as a Jew, but had been brought to term by a non-Jew, so then one might argue that by the same token, the child is going to be considered to be, not Jewish by virtue of the fact that the birth mother is not Jewish. In other words, here you have a case where it's the bringing the term is going to be considered to be the determining factor, and not the question of the genetic material because genetically the person was not Jewish. If you want to say that that identity as a Jew or non-Jew is a genetic question, was Jewish genetically, but is brought to term by a woman who is not Jewish. So this is really the question. Having said that, I'm only going to look at one of these sources, not both number 6 and number 7. I'm just going to look at number 6. It's not totally clear. In other words, even having said what I just said, it's because how do we view the child when they're, or the children in this case, in the terms of twins, when they are being born? So it would seem as though they are being born to a Jewish mother, because again, the case where she converted while she was pregnant, they're being born to a Jewish mother, and therefore they're being born Jews. This isn't totally the case, because here, or I shouldn't say totally the case. That might be the way it's understood. But Tosfot, for example, in a different sugya, Tosfot talks about the following situation, a much more common situation, which is dealt with halachically all the time, in terms of, and we've spoken about this as well, the question of a convert who is a convert at the time when he is or she is a child. What is that convert's status? How can a person who is not who doesn't have has not yet entered majority and therefore doesn't have full legal standing, how can that person accept Judaism upon himself or upon herself? So Tosfot is of the opinion that this is, well, I don't want to get too far afield in that, but Tosfot talks about the following within that discussion of a convert who is a minor at the time of the conversion and how to deal with that situation. Tosfot says the following observation, with not thinking about our situation at all, but it has ramifications to it. So he said, Tosfot says, "Mishkachat la ger katan min haTorah." So we can discuss. Tosfot is of the opinion that the whole idea of conversion is not that we're going to treat that child as a Jew is only rabbinic, and that the child isn't considered to be halachically a Jew min haTorah until they reach majority, they reach bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah age. But he says there is one case where a child who is a minor is a convert, and that conversion is accepted by the Torah. What case is that? B'mu'uberet shenit gaira, our case that we've been just speaking about for the last few minutes. If you're dealing with a pregnant woman who converts, so the child is considered to be a viable convert, Tosfot is saying. So he's saying, Ein tzarich tefillah v'have ger min haTorah d'Yisrael gamorhu. So he is considered to be a full Jew by virtue of the fact that he converted while his mother's conversion worked for him. That's what Tosfot is saying. And then the birth is sort of finishes the deal. But if you were to have a situation, so Tosfot is then in effect saying that you never really have a scenario where you have a non-Jew who's born to a Jewish woman, because already there has been a conversion of that child, of that fetus in utero, and it's that convert who's born to, or converts, in the case of the twins, who are born to a Jewish woman. If that's the case, so then you have no precedent to work with at all in these circumstances. Rabbi Yaakov Ariel, for example, the chief Rav of Ramat Gan and the very influential posek, is very strongly of the opinion that that it's the genetic parents or genetic mother who is the real mother here, and not the birth mother. And he says, with regard to this case that we just brought, in terms of the understanding, is that the whole case will only applies in this circumstance because the genetic material if you will, the fetuses are already considered to be Jewish, and therefore the birth mother is going to have an impact on them. And it's her own child. She's the genetic mother. And that is what is making the difference. If you were to have a situation as we have with regard in cases of either ovum donation or a situation of a surrogate mother. So in either of those circumstances, when the genetic material is not the genetic material of the birth mother, so then that's the halakha doesn't have any cases at all that deal with it, and we should follow that instinct that I mentioned earlier, that we should be viewing the genetic mother as being the mother and not the birth mother. There is a couple of we will say agadic sources. I won't say, we'll say they are agadic sources that perhaps shed light on this. One, even though I put it in a certain order, I'm going to go in the other order. I'm going to look first at number 9, number 10 and number 11. One, because if you will, from the wow factor is looking at it. I should have put it that way because we'll build up. So the first case is looking at Hadassah Esther as our precedent case. The Megillah says when we are introduced to Esther, that Vayhi, source number 10 here, Vayhi omen et Hadassah hi Esther bat Doda ki ein la av ve'em. So explaining why Mordechai is the adoptive father of Esther. So we're told that Esther is either his niece or his cousin, and she had no father nor mother, and then tells us that she is an attractive young lady. And then uvimot avia v'ima lekacha Mordechai lo levat. So when her parents had passed away, so Mordechai had adopted her. Whatever the levat means, we will leave that aside for another discussion. But we'll just say the way that it was that we all learned the story when we were younger, when we were in elementary school, that that Esther was Mordechai's adopted daughter. The Midrash looks at the question here. The Midrash is the Gemara and Megillah. The Midrash wants to know, why does the pasuk have to tell us this fact about Esther's parents twice? Already told us ein la av ve'em. She had no parents, no one to take care of her. Fine, got that. But then we have uvimot avia v'ima. We have that redundancy seems to be redundant. Why do you need that? So this is the drasha. Ki ein la av ve'em uvimot avia v'ima. So here, source number 11, the Gemara and Megillah. Lamali, why do I need this? Amar Rav Acha ibarta meit aviha yelata meita ima. So a very tragic story. But basically, what Rav Acha wants to say is that we're told that Esther never had any parents at all, in terms of that there wasn't a moment in her life that she had her biological parents at her disposal. When when she was conceived, her father had passed away, and her mother passed away in childbirth. So from the moment she was born, she was childless. She was parentless. Had I only had ein la av ve'em, I could say that her parents had passed away when she was a small child, and Mordechai adopted her. This way, we are known or being told that in effect, from the moment of birth, Esther was already in Mordechai's charge. Okay. Rashi takes this one step further, perhaps. Rashi says, B'sha'a, it is a commentary to that Gemara, his explanation. Rashi says, B'sha'a shlit abra ima meit aviha, nimtza shelo haya la'av mishat lahakrot la'av. So this becomes an important point. Rashi, this has, we're not going to talk about it, but this has ramifications, not with regard to maternity that we're dealing with now, but with regard to paternity. So Rashi says here we have a situation where the conception was, since we know conception doesn't happen instantaneously, so they'd had their relations, and then the father died within moments or within hours of that sexual act. So then the conception happened after the father was already dead. So does that mean that perhaps halachically she had no father? Legally, she perhaps had no father. And then when it comes to kshielata ima meta, velo nir'et likrot em. So she wasn't around to be called a mother. So does that mean, how do you understand that? Is it simply the way that I explained it before, that it's sort of a sociological fact that she was this orphan at birth? Or is it that in the time of until the modern era, so basically a cesarean section was a death sentence to the mother? And so basically you could say that the mother died on the birth stool, and the child had not yet been born, and Esther was a cesarean birth after her mother had passed away. In which case, if you're saying that it's the birth that allows a child, if you will, to connect legally with his or her mother. So Esther never really had a legal father and never had a legal mother. So this is again used as a source for the idea that it's going to be the birth mother. Even more, I guess you could say, almost fantastical, and this is sort of really mind-blowing, is the following Targum. There is a midrashic tradition. Before I get to reading number 8, midrashic tradition that basically says that, getting back to Rachel and Leah, that Leah, when she had her seventh pregnancy turns out to be her only daughter, Dinah, but in that seventh pregnancy, that she did the math. She understood that there were going to be, she was a Neviah, she was a prophetess, and she had this, by virtue of Ruach HaKodesh, she understood that there were going to be 12 tribes. And she already had 6 sons. There were 2 shvachot, there were 2 servants, so that's Bilha and Zilpah. They already had 2 children each, which means that there are only 2 tribes that are going to still be born. And now she's pregnant with her 7th child. So in a very broadly accepted midrashic tradition, she prays that she should have a daughter. In effect, that she would not be the mother of 7 tribes, leaving her sister to at most have 1 tribe and be, in terms of her status, inferior to the 2 servants who already had 2 tribes each. And in the standard, if you will, the standard midrashic tradition, her prayer is answered. And even though the child that was conceived was a boy, was a male, so there was a sex change operation in utero, and Dinah becomes is turned into in terms of becomes a girl, becomes female. And that is connected to the name of Dinah, of judgment, that she made this judgment in order to work for her sister's, Rachel's, benefit. There is a really wild midrash, which is brought in one of the Targumim, known as Targum Yerushalmi, or the Targum of Yonatan ben Uziel, on that pasuk in Bereshit. And I'm just going to read the English. I'm not going to read the Aramaic. Anyone who wants to go through the Aramaic can see it. But here, afterwards, she bare a daughter. She had this daughter and called her name Dinah. Why is she called Dinah? For she said, judgment is from before the Lord, that there shall be from me half a tribes. But from Rachel, my sister, shall go forth 2 tribes, even as they shall proceed from each of the handmaids. And the prayer of Leah was heard before the Lord. Now get this. The infants were changed in their wombs, and Joseph was given to the womb of Rachel, and Dinah to the womb of Leah. So according to this, it wasn't that simply, okay, Rachel is going to hopefully have a child, and I'm praying that my child should not be one of the tribes, so that there will be that Rachel will have 2 tribes, but rather that Rachel was already pregnant, and she was the biological mother of Dinah, and Leah is the biological mother of Yosef. And somehow the babies get switched. They don't have to wait, to have that situation in the nursery. They're switched in utero, miraculously. Now, you can imagine in all of this, there's always the question of how much credence are we going to give Agadic statements in terms of determining halacha. And there's a lot to be said here on the Agadic level, Midrashic level. I wish I had the time to get into it. I'm trying to understand the Midrash, what the Midrash is trying to get across. But basically, can you derive the Gemara doesn't, the Targum at least doesn't seem to have a problem to be saying that even though Yosef is the biological child of Leah, we all view Yosef as being the legal child of Rachel. So it's clearly that the birth mother is the mother and not the biological, not the genetic mother, because then even if he had been born to Rachel, he still should be considered the son of Leah, and Dinah, even though she's born to Leah, should still be considered the daughter of Rachel. So that is brought as being a precedent, if you will, to say that it's the birth mother. Here too, even if you're willing to accept it, so the way that later commentators use this shows that that's not necessarily the case. So here I've brought number 9 is the Perush of the Tur, Rav Yaakov ben Asher Bal HaTurim, most famous for his massive halachic work called the Tur. But he also writes a very entertaining, I would say, comment. Any of you who are familiar with the commentary of the Tur on the Torah know how entertaining and interesting his commentary is and unique. So he tackles this particular story. So, but in a different context. The context that he talks about is the context where the child, a different medrash. The medrash is that that Shimon, Simon married Dinah, and of course the question is, how is that possible? How is a brother allowed to marry a sister, even though the Torah had not yet been given? And this is another discussion that we can have at some other time. To what extent was Torah and mitzvot binding on the avot? But we'll leave that aside, because even if it isn't binding, he says that non-Jews aren't allowed to marry their sisters either, from a halachic perspective. So how could Dinah marry Shimon? That's the question. And this is his answer. He says, Ulefi ha-midrash ati shapir, she'ikar hirayon shel Dinah haya bebeten Rachel. So he uses this medrash of the switch to answer another medrash to explain it. He's saying that legally, Dinah is considered to be not Leah's son, but Rachel's son. In other words, he's saying, you know what, we call Yosef, he doesn't talk about Yosef, but presumably this is what he would say. We call Yosef ben Rachel. We call Dinah bat Leah. But is that a sociological association, or is that a legal association? Remarkably, at least according to the Tur, and remember the Tur, as I said, is considered to be one of the most influential halachic figures in Jewish history. So at least according to the Tur, it's the biological mother and the genetic mother that's the determining factor. Legally, Yosef remains the son of Leah. Legally, Dinah remains the daughter of Rachel. Again, it doesn't matter to me, I want to stress, it doesn't matter to me whether you actually think that this is what happened. And it doesn't matter to me whether the Torah thinks it is what happened, or you're learning a medra from these midrashim, different ideas. It doesn't, that's not what's really important here. What's important is that the legal concepts that are being used. So he's saying that yes, Rachel remains the legal mother of Dinah, and Leah remains the legal mother of Yosef, and that is how they're going to be viewed. In actuality, there isn't that much importance in terms of legality, because they're all the children of Yaakov, and so in terms of inheritance and in terms of, I saw in the chat someone asked about half sisters, in terms of incest, so that isn't going to be a factor either. So it's a moot point in terms of legal as opposed to sociological, but he's making the distinction, and that would mean that in our case of a surrogate mother, or in the inverse, the egg donor. So then you would have a situation where we would follow the genetic mother and not the birth mother, and using the exact medrash that some of the authorities try to use as a precedent, you can show that at least the Tur disagreed with them. Just to answer that question with regard to incest with a half sibling, it's true, halachically, that is the case, but in terms of the situation before Matan Torah and the situation that exists post Matan Torah for non-Jews, because non-Jews, one of the 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach is Gilui Arayot, is incest, but it's defined differently for non-Jews than it is for Jews. There is an expansion for Jews to include half siblings as well, but in the if you will, the original version of it for humanity. So that is the incest is if the child is of the same mother, not if the child is of only if the child is of the same father. It also explains how perhaps how Abraham could marry Sara, similar type of logic that's being employed there. Some proofs very quickly, the few minutes that I have left to talk about, even though we could say that it's something which is something that we would think of as being as being logical and being instinctive, that it's the genetic material. By the way, I should just point out that it might be more instinctive for us because of our understanding of biology. But to remember that it's even up to the 18th century, when people were looking at sperm for the first time under the microscope, so they thought that they saw a fully formed embryo in that bit of sperm, and that the mother was acting as basically as fertile ground for the seed which was coming from the father. So it's not so once you deal with if you will, a moving target in terms of what the scientific understanding is. So it could very well be that the legal standing is going to be determined by what is not what is incontrovertible. So since you can argue and it might turn that at this point maybe we won't argue it anymore, but you could argue throughout most of human history as to how a child is formed, but you can't argue as to how the child is born. So that, as a result, will determine the legal relationship, that incontrovertible fact of the birth mother, and the genetic mother is not considered to be as significant. So that is certainly a logical possibility in terms of understanding it. However, and this is a Gemara that I think that we're most of the people, maybe even all of the people who are in on the shir now, are familiar with. It's quoted in different contexts all the time. The Gemara says the following, number 13, Shlosha shutafin yesh be'adam. So there are three partners to every human being, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, va'aviv v'imo. So God and his two parents, or her two parents. So now this is used, it's probably the number one quote in any bar mitzvah, or at a brit milah, perhaps under the chuppah, sheva brachot, etc. Having said that, the Gemara continues, and this is less well known. The Gemara says, what is it that the three partners give to the partnership? Aviv mazriya haloven. So there is forget about whether it's accurate from a scientific perspective. The father gives the white stuff. Shemimenu atzamot gidim v'tziparnayim. So the things that are white in our bodies, the bones, the tendons, the fingernails, the brain, the gray matter, the white of the eye. These are, according to this version, that's what's contributed by the father. The imo mazret odem, but the mother gives the red stuff. Shemimenu or v'basar v'sa'arot. So that is the skin, the flesh, the hair. I guess the Gemara didn't have any blondes. Shachor sheba'ayin, the pupil of our eyes. That comes from the mother. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God noten bo ruach uneshama. So God gives the spirit, gives the soul, the klaster panim, the form that we all have, the riyat ha'ayin, the ability to see, the ability to hear. In other words, God gives the life force to our bodies. But the fact that the mother is giving, what's the partnership of the parents? What's important here is that the partnership of the parents is the genetics. So I don't care whether it's a accurate description or not, but it's saying that the biological component is what turns the father into the father, and the biological component is what turns the mother into the mother. That is that is I think a pretty strong indication that this is how we should be looking at it. There are others, and there are many. I'm not going to get into sources. Well, you see, I added it here, and I didn't fix the numbers 1414. But in any event, I'm not going to get into that right now because of the time constraint. But I'm just going to point out that it is possible to have at least moot the case that we have multiple mothers, and especially this is actually the position of I think most forcefully put forward by Rabbi Bilha in several articles that he wrote. The links I said are attached in this article, but you can find them on Tradition Online. That he is of the belief that you can talk about multiple parentage in terms of from a legal perspective, and that both the birth mother and the genetic mother should be considered to be mothers. I'm not going to, unfortunately, because of the time constraint, so I'm not going to. I'll just I don't have time to. But this is what's brought here in number 15 and number 16 in terms of understanding this. That that you can have a perhaps moot a situation. I'll just, without getting into the argument, it's based on a line in a Tosfot where Tosfot says, with regard to the lineage of Goliath, Goliath of David and Goliath fame, that the Gemara says, one of the opinions says that he had that his mother had relations with 100 men, and the Gemara is clearly casting aspersion on his parents or his mother, but also the Tosfot takes it one step further, and he wants to claim that it is actually that he was the genetic material of the sperms all contributed to his to his conception, that he was really the issue of 100 men. So it doesn't really matter to me whether it's possible or not. Tosfot might have thought that it is possible. Maybe it is possible, maybe it's not possible. You can look it up. There is a phenomena of two sperms fertilizing one egg. It's not, generally speaking, a viable fetus. There is 3 sets of chromosomes, and that creates a terrible birth defect. But the fact is that it is that Tosfot is viewing it as a possibility that legally Goliath had multiple fathers. So Rabbi Bilha wants to claim, he has other proofs as well. Number 17 is one of his proofs, but that you can say that there is this concept, at least, of logically there being multiple parents. Now, having said this, halachically, what do people do? So it is. And in America, I know it's the standard practice. Given this question, it seems if you were to line up the poskim and sort of add them up, it seems that the majority of the poskim, based on that first Gemara that we said, that we cited, the question of the twins, which really of all of the Gemarot is the one which is the one which would lead us to have a firm legal kind of footing. Based on that, many of the poskim, it seems to be the basic position of Rav Eliashiv. It's the position of Rav Ovadia. Rav Ovadia went back and forth a little bit, as did Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. The position of Rav Eliyahu Zatzal. And others, that the birth mother should be considered to be the mother. Other poskim disagree strongly. Rav Asher Weiss, Rav Ariel, as I mentioned, and others are of the position that it should be the genetic mother. Rav Shlomo Zalman suggested or highly recommended that perhaps that we should view both mothers as being the halachic mother l'chumra, meaning that however you want to, that if the child, if either birth mother or genetic mother, for example, is non-Jewish, the child should undergo a conversion l'chumra, just to make sure that that child is going to be considered to be Jewish l'chol hadayah. Of course, that leads into other questions, which that if you have that situation, so then if the child is going to be considered to be a convert, so then it would mean that questions of inheritance, as I mentioned before, questions of kahuna, if the father is a kohen, so then perhaps the child will not be considered to be kohen, and this is of course issues that are very sticky, this becomes, if you will, the way that in most cases it is dealt with, that the child, when one parent or the other, one mother or the other, is not Jewish, that there is a gerut l'chumra, but it is, as I said earlier, really very much a question which has not reached a real consensus along the lines of a completely different area of halacha. There's a very strong consensus in terms of let's say electricity, that we might not know why electricity is forbidden on Shabbat, but that electricity is forbidden on Shabbat. when it comes to the this, which is a more recent technological development, but it's still open and may remain open. So that's an interesting phenomena. It could be, and with this I'll close, it could be the reason why it hasn't reached a clear consensus as how to deal with it, even though we're talking about, at this point, tens of thousands of individuals who've been born through surrogacy, certainly thousands, if not tens of thousands, is that there is if you will, a fix. As if you have the gay root, so it creates, as I said, other issues, but it's not creating a situation where you need to have it's not a zero-sum game. You don't need to have a clear decision in one direction or the other, as long as you have a path to move forward. So that leaves the question open. But whether that's the rationale behind why there isn't a clear-cut consensus, or perhaps some other reason, but that remains the fact. So this was, as I said, certainly I'm not, as I always give my caveat, I'm certainly not stating a halachic position myself. I'm just bringing the issues to the fore for you to have a better understanding of, and the fact, to go back to the beginning of this year, the fact that this is an issue that goes to last week's parsha, this week's parsha, coming week's parshiot, the desire and the basic human need to bring children into the world has led people to be seeking out surrogates from the very dawn of Judaism, if not the dawn of history, and the legal questions remain an open question, almost the way that they were more than 3,000 years ago. Okay.
אוקיי, אנחנו סיימנו?
כן, סיימנו.
טוב, תודה רבה.
אוקיי.
תודה רבה ושבת שלום.
טוב.